You're listening to Frontier Matters, the podcast from 1914 Reader. Join us as we dive into bold conversations on growth and change in the frontier economies of the world.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Frontier Matters. It's Tobi and I again today. And Tobi, hi, how's it going?
I'm all right, man. Nice to always do this with you.
Cool.
I guess the next episode we should have a guest.
Yeah. Hopefully,
Okay.
we should have a guest. Yeah.
Hopefully the audience are not bored with us already.
All right. So today we wanted to talk about what we might call the real China shock. So obviously, there's been a lot of displacement activity in the sense that Trump came in January with his tariffs and all of that on Chinese goods. And then a lot of Chinese goods, obviously, so the import of Chinese goods to the US has obviously dropped, and quite dramatically because of the tariffs and all. So the numbers I'm looking at here says the US between Q3 2025, so up to the end of September, compared with Q3 2024. September 2024. So a year before that, the value of China's exports to the US dropped by $38 billion. And, obviously that was the largest drop. So I think there was also a drop to Russia of about $5 billion. But what has then happened correspondingly on the other side is that a lot of other countries are now buying a lot more from China. And we want to try and look at, what exactly are these things happening? And obviously, Nigeria is one of the biggest where the change has happened. So for Nigeria, it's been a 45% increase in Chinese imports in that same corresponding period. So, as it's dropped by 35 billion to the US, it's increased by 45% to Nigeria. And the Nigerian imports, the increase in imports are made up of things like electric cars, solar panels. Obviously, everyone knows that one. There's been a bit more iron and steel, and then there's been batteries as well. So I think the NYT article at the time said something like China only sold about 100 electric cars to Nigeria a couple of years ago. This year, the number is 1,000. So obviously, some of that is just the technology's time has sort of come, but also the fact that China is actually really pushing a lot of this stuff out there. So, one of the things that got us talking about this, got Tobi and I talking about, was somebody mentioned to me, and I won't mention the name of the company, but somebody mentioned to me that there's a popular company in Lagos that sells a lot of Chinese goods, and that what they were doing was that they were bringing in a lot of stuff through the Lekki Free Trade Zone, basically not paying custom duties on it, right? So they were bringing all kinds of stuff. So finished goods, intermediate goods, and literally just flooding the market with all kinds of stuff. So, obviously, Nigeria doesn't really have any manufacturing, that much manufacturing stuff, but I'm surprised that this has not seemed to make it out into the media, for example. So because, look, there are hardly any Nigerian manufacturers that can survive a Chinese onslaught, if it happens.
True.
So I'm surprised they're not talking about it. But everyone seems to be talking about the Dangote refinery and all of that. But for this one. So I guess we could start off saying, Tobi, obviously you are on the ground in Lagos and all that, what have you noticed in terms of maybe in the last 1 year, the influx of Chinese goods and what are your thoughts on all of this?
So I think that personally for me, I wouldn't say that I have noticed much, but simply from an observational perspective, the story that was shared, obviously you shared this with me when the person reached out to you. And I believe my comment then was that this has been ongoing for a while. Again, I won't also mention names. I came across a story a few years ago, and this was around the time when the e-hailing bike was a thing in Lagos, of a popular Chinese company that was bringing in these motorcycles like in droves, like in the hundreds, and just flooding the market. And I was not a fan of how that motor or that sector or that burgeoning business was killed off. I was not a fan. But I also worry at the time about the scale at which, you go to bus stops in Lagos and it was just bikes, like in the dozens, and this is for a city with no real infrastructure. I mean, Lagos very well, so none of this is strange to that. It's not like there are bike lanes. It's not like the bus stops are so huge, and they were just everywhere. So, and I recall then that this is not sustainable, especially the scale at which these bikes were just being brought in. There was no regulation, there was nothing. But I think the deeper issue that I think we should explore is precisely how we do trade in Nigeria, where the trade regime itself has no coherence beyond tariffs. We doubt that the Nigerian government today knows what comes into Nigeria and at what scale, right?
Yeah.
So, but as long as you can't tax it, just, as we say, you are only interested if you can extort from it. And that's why a trade policy is in the shambles, and we've not been able to unlock the growth effect from more trade, basically, because the only reason we are interested in trade is how much revenue customs can get and who can be protected and at what point. Secondly, is that you talked about making it into the media. I think the intellectual environment currently has changed significantly, I would say, in the last 10, 15 years, in the sense that I don't think even people that have protectionists, and I mean, that accounts for almost everybody, that is anybody who speaks in the media, who have protectionist instincts, they don't really have a problem with China. The anti-trade views of Nigerian elites is usually anti-West views.
Yeah. There's a dovetail. It does. People are fine. A lot of them are fine with China.
Yeah. So, I really don't know why, and I think it's a mixed bag of issues. Part of it has to do with China's geopolitics and how it deals with these countries. Oh no, we are not going to talk about human rights. We'll give you money for infrastructure. We'll invest. You can do whatever you want. And then there's this other angle of promoting this narrative that neoliberalism is bad for you. You can grow the China way. This is how we did it, by closing off our markets, by tariffing everything, and which again, ironically, does not apply to trade with China. So I think that is the nuance that we have to walk tightly in this conversation, in the sense that I think you and I are both pro trade, at least pro freer trade in a sense, but there is the insidious effect that trade with China also have on countries. And specifically what that means is that for the past 40 odd years of the global economic environment as designed or constituted under the so-called rules-based international order, led by the US, of course, the general paradigm and what has always happened is that there is an enrichment effect to being open to trade. So
Yes.
Japan became an American ally, of course, restructured its economy towards exports. The biggest market was the American market, and Japan got rich. And the same happened with Taiwan, happened with South Korea, and a few others that may not have such a dramatic convergence effect in terms of income, but the story is similar. But
And China
particularly,
itself.
and China itself, absolutely, China itself. And I mean, even more dramatically in the case of China was after the WTO ascension in 2001, and how China hugely benefited from that. But what you see with China is that China as a trading partner does not really offer you any benefit, precisely access to its markets. access to its markets, and also something that I know that you and I have also talked about, which you've also written about, perhaps not on 1914 for some reason, is the technology transfer. I recall we were talking about railway technology. And the point you made is that China basically exports its mistakes to a lot of the infrastructure projects that happens. So, I mean, a lot of these Chinese investment, there's almost no technology transfer of any sort. And even behind the economic numbers and indicators, in a former life, I do business with Chinese firms, and even basic things like commodities that expatriates and other, immigrants participating in the local economy, you find that the Chinese are almost religiously opposed to that. They don't buy shoes here, they don't buy clothes here, they don't eat in Nigerian restaurants. So it's almost like they don't spend in your economy. I can't say.
There was a story from, I don't know if you remember this book. Sorry, the Next Factory of the World, by the lady who she wrote the book at the time, and she focused, Irene Son, So, and there was a part she described in it where she talked about a Chinese operation in Lagos. So I think it was something to do with the Oriental guys, but basically they had a staff canteen at the time where they were paying with WeChat. Like I didn't know how that was possible. And this was a long time ago. This was over a decade ago. It was basically a little China where the payments for stuff in there, well, obviously everything was Chinese food and all of that, but then they were actually making payments with WeChat. And I guess that was the precursor to OPay really blowing out into Nigeria. But even I just thought to myself that even for something as simple as just making payments in another country at the time, they relied entirely on Chinese infrastructure.
Yeah. So I mean, that gives you. But I don't want to paint too bleak a picture or make this sound too dramatic, because I mean, obviously they're going to consume services. I mean, in my gym, Chinese people, Indian people, so they consume services. Some things are inevitable, but I think specifically what we are trying to tease out is how it affects the manufacturing capability of the country and the trading partner, and it applies more. So this concept of the ladder of development, which we have also written about on 1914, is, as you grow, as you become richer, you exit the lower rung of the ladder. You exit the low skill, labor intensive manufacturing. You exit the garment making. You exit the leather making. You exit all these for, poorer countries to move into that space, and then you buy from them. You become an export market from them. And we haven't seen China really do that. Rather, Premier C wants to spread itself up and down the ladder and take up the whole space. So I'm curious what you think.
Yeah. So I think it's a good point. I mean, obviously, like you mentioned, we've talked about that ladder quite a lot. There was a point that was made in, Dan Wang's book where he talked about Xi Jinping's policy of completionism. Which, I mean, other people call it different things. I think some others call it maybe dual circulation. But essentially, what it is that Xi Jinping saying, China must not give up any part of manufacturing, right? So no matter how small it is, that they must not give up any part of it. And he said it openly. It wasn't a secret recording or anything. It's an actual Chinese policy. So which is why you then get this whole weird in the sense of kind of unprecedented, where China is the world's biggest manufacturer of wigs. It's also the world's biggest manufacturer of some advanced train technology, advanced EVs, batteries, all that kind of stuff. So basically, at every point in the chain, nothing is given. I think China produces maybe like 70% of the world's wigs, chemicals, any kind of thing, right? So now, one of my favorite stories, which I've referenced the story several times, and maybe I'll put a link in the show notes to the story, was when when China was trying to master how to master steel making, basically, they went to a German farm. They purchased a German steel making plant called from ThyssenKrupp, and I mean there are pictures of the Chinese guys. Basically, they dismantled the entire shipping plant. The Chinese guys were in Germany for a long time. They dismantled it and they labeled each part of this. I mean, this is a big steel making plant. So they labeled every part meticulously, put everything on a ship, sent it to China, and then reassembled it in China. And obviously in that whole process, they gained a lot of knowledge. When if you can, because copying sounds easy, but it's not that straightforward to do. So when you can break it down and put it back together, and that was what kind of like seeded the Chinese steel making industry. Now, when you look at it now, the Germans obviously let them do that. For Germany, maybe it was no big deal. Like, yeah, you guys, yeah, you want to buy this, you want to take it away? Yeah, fine, no problem. Pay for it and all that. So the Germans let them do that. Now, if I was to think about it now, and I imagine that, can you imagine somebody going to China, buying a company that has some valuable technology, and then Xi Jinping just lets you walk out of China with it?
Yeah,
It's not going to happen.
yeah, that's the point.
It will never happen.
Like, can a
Exactly.
Thai company do that, or can a
They
Filipino
definitely
company
not.
do that in China?
Definitely not. So they definitely won't let you do that. So again, this is that whole gumming up stuff. So whereby, your options are to buy from China. Now, like you said, you and I are both pro trade, but this kind of puts you in a very almost uncomfortable position in the sense that when you're not thinking about it, that okay, so fine, we should trade. Like, we've argued endlessly against tariffs. But then, how should we then calibrate that trade when you're dealing with someone? First of all, it can be very, very difficult to draw the distinction between what is a private company in China and what is actually a state-backed company, right? So, I mean, the line is very, very blurry. You can never really tell. Sometimes you might think you're dealing with just another private company, but actually there's a state policy or some real state backing behind them. So that's the first part. And then secondly, when that state has a policy of saying, we are not going to give up anything, right? So the only option we want you to buy from us to kind of create a reliance on all of you. And then with that's we're starting to see. I mean, we're discussing a paper earlier, a new Goldman Sachs paper earlier, which kind of like say basically the conclusion of the Goldman Sachs report was that increased exports have helped China, but they don't see any increase in GDP for the rest of the world. So either as time goes on, the rest of the world are going to cut in on us. Okay, and maybe this is not really good for us, and then we need to really. I mean, you've seen Brazil, for example, and a few other countries. They've come up with actually. I mean, they actually had, big tariffs on Chinese imports even before Trump came back into office, and all of that, because a lot of people have been worried about the fact that, first of all, one of the things I always tell people, I try to tell people and understand is that, look, one thing the Chinese government does really well is that they can be pro business without being pro market without being pro business. So if they want a certain industry, they don't care, right? Like they will actually encourage a kind of fierce competition in-house. So they'll give you all the backing, they'll protect you from outsiders, they'll give you all the subsidies, they'll give you cheap energy and all of that, but you are not going to be protected. You cannot say, oh, some guy that is close to Xi Jinping, he's the one controlling one sector and all of that. No, and I always say, I always try to go back to cement. The Chinese cement industry today is actually sane and calm and all of that. But if you go back 20 years ago or something, it was a brutal scene, right? So thousands of cement companies, all of them fighting each other, many of them making losses. You see the same thing now with with the solar panel industry, for example. Prices have come down because the competition internally is so brutal. I think the Chinese solar industry lost $60 billion last year, as an industry, So when you think about it that way, anybody that comes out of that kind of quote unquote Hunger Games of Chinese competition. I mean, can you imagine? So, like, say for example, there are 500 companies that were competing in one industry in China. The guy that comes number 257 can come to Nigeria and dominate everybody, because that fight that you've been in China, it is so brutal, and he has raised you to a certain level whereby when you go to another country where the competition, how much competition is there in Nigeria? If you wanted to come to Nigeria, for example, and to do even cement, how many people are competing with you? Maybe 2 or 3 people. Or if you wanted to do plastics, or if you wanted to do any kind of thing, right? There's very little competition. Nigeria, there's not that much going on. So if you come out of China's competition, if you make it out of there and you come, which is why you see, the best example is what's the name of the phone that got really popular in Nigeria, the smartphone, Transion. What's the name of their phone? Techno, right? Techno. Yeah. Now, Techno was a nobody in China, right? in a smartphone race in China, maybe they were going to come 100 and something, right? They were nobody, but they were able to come to Africa and pretty much just dominate Africa, because they kind of saw the signs earlier and say, look, we're not going to make anything in here in China, but maybe if we take some of the expertise, some of the supply chains, because, the supply chains are already in Shenzhen, you can get anything you want. Maybe we can go and explore other markets rather than staying at home here where the fight is so fierce. I mean, or look at EVs, for example. I mean, there were, I think I saw something, maybe there were about 30 or so different EV makers or something. But you can imagine the guy who comes number 29 in China, if he comes to Nigeria and sets up an EV plant, he'll blow everybody away and he'll just, have a monopoly to themselves. So because of those two things, whereby, first of all, you have a very, very gray line between the state and private business. On the one hand, you can never really tell which is which. And then second of all, because that state also encourages that fierce competition internally, whereby companies that come out of China are so battle hardened, they've seen every kind of competition that you can imagine, whereby if they come and look, I'm not blaming them for this, it's not like it's an unfair advantage, but if you come, if Nigeria, nothing is stopping Nigeria from actually creating the kind of internal competition that would allow, the survival of the fittest, who can then go out of Nigeria and then export, which is something that we've also talked about a lot, whereby, if you had internal competition, whoever rises out of that internal competition can then go outside of Nigeria and then become a real export champion, which would then really help the country. So, so those combination of those two things, the fact that the state and private business are often indistinguishable, and then second of all, that brutal Darwinian competition that raises firms who then come to a country like Nigeria and just like, Nigeria is meat and drink for them. You can see with things like, you see with OPay, how they've grown. You've seen it with all kinds of other different different Chinese business. And there'll be more to come, especially if this trade war with the US goes on. So it's something really to think about for policymakers. But then again, like I said, policymakers are only interested in tariffs. But it's something to think about in the sense that, you might think that you have something in Nigeria today. Maybe somebody has built a kind of industry or something that is producing, but, you always measure everything, any kind of manufacturing or any kind of, industry that's in Nigeria today. It might sound extreme, but the question to ask anything is that, can these guys survive Chinese competition, exposure to China, basically? Can this industry, whatever it is, can it survive any kind of exposure to Chinese competition? And probably 9 times out of 10, the answer will be no. And you then have to have some kind of policy response to that in terms of, okay, how are we going to actually support our businesses to actually stand on their own 2 feet and to be really, really battle ready and battle tested?
Yeah. So, Greg Eep on Twitter tweeted about the Goldman Sachs paper you were referencing to, and he said something that I think we should unpack. How the dynamics really works, which is, China's economic model, at least vis-a-vis trade, is beggar thy neighbor. So, I know it's not so simple, and I try to warn against simple theories, but let's imagine like a classic Adam Smith economy, right? That thrives on specialization. So I mow the lawns, you are a barber. There's a third guy who is a butcher, and we all benefit, by specializing in what we do. Not like I can barb my own hair if I want to, or that you can mow your own lawn if you want to, or I can cut my meat if I want to. But it's about opportunity cost. We all could use those time to benefit from doing other things than having to be the one that cut my meat, barb my hair, and mow the lawn at the same time. So, which is kind of like how the classic, Ricardian comparative advantage works in international trade. But in that three-way economy that I just described, imagine Fei then starts taking steroids such that opportunity costs becomes completely lowered. So you can mow your lawn, you can cut your meat, you can barb your hair because of this magical portion that you drink, without any time loss, without getting tired, without nothing. We, your neighbors, our welfare will actually be reduced in a way because you're going to dominate your own profession, but at the same time pose serious competition to us in what we do because you have an unfair advantage, which is what credit, the unfettered access to credit and the competitive environment that you talked about, the amount of state support that Chinese firms receive, that is the kind of advantage. It's like taking steroids. It really, really lowers opportunity cost because if your cost of capital is basically zero, I mean, you are starting right up from the gate with, incredible speed. And, this matters because it's beggar thy neighbor for trading partners, in the sense that China does not really open its market to anybody. It can like you said, it can outcompete your local firms because it has all these unfair advantages, both geopolitically, strategically, and even in terms of capacity. Also, there is almost, especially with low-income countries, there is almost always no formalized or institutional trade agreement of any sort. So it usually doesn't have to play by any rules. Right, it's just, and of course, I mean, they will sweeten the pie by infrastructure investment here and there, free trade zones that never really, really work or become any economic growth engine. But they are just there, and you understand. So, and it also helps to understand why China is the way it is. I recall a paper by Danny Roderick a couple of years, sometimes around the mid 2000s. And what he actually said, I think with Ricardo Hausman, I'm not sure. And what they actually claimed in that paper and tried to show empirically was that even at that time, China's manufacturing capacity and its capability was way above comparable countries at its income level. So China has already mastered production of certain technologies and goods, a proficiency level that is higher than its current income level. And I think that's also a strategic choice because of this whole great power competition with the US. So like, oh, I'm going to master shipbuilding. I'm going to master steel making because, okay, those are export powerhouses. They provide a lot of local jobs. But I also want to master chip making because that is how I compete with the US, the Americans, because whatever it is, who knows what might happen. And those have implications militarily, geopolitically and other strategic industries like, aviation, weapon system, missile systems. And so this is a deliberate choice that China is making. And like the Goldman Sachs paper claimed, the world is going to be poorer for it. The question then is, how do we respond? And I think this is where things have gotten a bit sad if you look at the way the current environment, policy environment is. First of all, is that low income countries, for example, like Nigeria, just do not play the game, probably because we don't understand the rules and we never really take our time to learn it. So why is it that trade policy for us always starts and ends with tariffs? A lot of how China has benefited from trade, even protectionist policies, like, I mean, you did a piece where you unpacked China's industrial policy. Most of what they did were non-tariff measures. Right?
Yeah.
Most of what they do was non-tariff measures. And we have, perhaps not to the same scale, we have similar leverage in the sense that, everybody sees Nigeria as this 200 million strong market, which gives us, I mean, when you look at the actual income level, well, the reality is different, but it offers you an advantage for you to actually strike deals that benefit your local manufacturing sector. Either it's in the energy, all these low level tech industries where we can create a lot of jobs, we can transfer some know-how, and start building real solid industrial base. A lot of the agreements we signed for special trade zones, how many of them were technical agreements? What were the details? How many of them were partnerships with local firms in a way that actually transfer operational efficiency and technological know-how? Zero. Trade policy always starts and stop with tariffs for us, and we need to be more sensible and strategic than that. Non-tariff measures are actually really the meat and bone of industrial policy. And secondly, I think that on the other end of that scale, it was really a bad choice for Donald Trump and whatever intellectual environment that nurtured anti-China aggressive move in Washington. It was really a bad time, right? It was the wrong time to really, really push China to the wall. As a matter of fact, I think this is a time where America should be leading in advocating for freer, more open trade, as opposed to what it is doing now. This is a time for America to actually strike alliances the way it did in the previous 30, 35 years. That is not the way. The way is that trade makes you richer. Trade does not make you poorer. And we will lead, by showing you that when you trade with America, you benefit your economy, you make money, you create jobs, but unfortunately, it is at the time when, America itself is, withdrawing basically from the world stage, and, everything is just a complete mess. But what I would like to ask you is that internally, you've been watching China for a long time. Internally, what do you think are the internal pressures that sustains this strategy for China? Is it basically the fear that we might be stuck in a middle income trap if we open up too much? Because yes, the Chinese economy has done really, really well when we look at export capacity and even absolute GDP numbers. But China is still basically a middle income country, right? And the population does not really consume much. So what do you think? Is it this anxiety of being stuck in middle income that sort of drives and sustains this policy, because it's crazy.
So it's a very interesting question. Funny enough, there was an article I read, I think it was a week ago, in the NYT by a Chinese writer in China, and she was taking the view that, look, a lot of these things that have made China respected abroad, dominating industries and all of that, are actually things that are making a lot of Chinese people in China annoyed and angry. So, for example, one of the examples she used was the rare earths, right? So now rare earths are a very costly industry to dominate, in the sense that, to be honest, for anything else, I'm happy for China to have all the rare earths processing facility in the world. It is such a dirty business because, first of all, you need to have the rare earths in large quantities in a specific area. So, I mean, literally anywhere you dig in the world, you can find rare earths. But the problem is whether you have enough of them, because this is literally, you're digging out huge amount of earth, and maybe what you're getting out of it is 1% or less than 1% for what you really need. And obviously, it's just those three elements, the ones that actually go into magnets, that are the most valuable of them, right? So she made the point that, look, this thing, that even though it's made China have leverage on the world, but for a lot of Chinese people, all they see about it is just the pollution, right? Because it has really polluted the environment. There are all kinds of stuff, and there are also a lot of domestic pressures, in China. So, like, I mean, housing, right? So Xi Jinping decided to pop the bubble. That's what he said he wanted to do anyway, to pop the housing bubble. But you see, the challenge is even far worse than anywhere else in the West. A lot of Chinese wealth is tied up in property. So once that, drop in prices happened, a lot of Chinese people, obviously, they couldn't spend, and it filtered through to the rest of the economy, right? So, and then obviously housing is expensive. So the cost of living pressures that people are facing in the West is also happening in China in different ways. So, she basically said that, look, they'll be happy to give up a lot of all these things that, the Chinese government thinks are always the source of our strength and all that kind of stuff, and then you have a whole economy of 200 million gig workers, whereby, there's a lot of precarity in employment, right? So in the solar industry, for example, I think something like 1/3 of the workers in the solar industries were laid off last year because of these huge, giant losses that they are making. But at the same time, obviously, China is exporting an incredible amount of solar panels. They're sending to Nigeria, they're sending to Pakistan, and we see all the numbers, right? But back home, it's a big challenge. So I think it's an interesting way, in the sense that obviously the Chinese government is not democratically elected, so they operate on an enlightened ruler basis, in the sense that they are doing what they think is the best for the Chinese people. But a lot of those things, the two of them are actually at polar opposites. So what a lot of Chinese people want, and I can't tell how much, what percentage of it, but I think what a lot of Chinese people want, they don't really care about China dominating rare earth industry, or selling all the EVs in the world, or dominating batteries, or that. I think they actually want a much better life back. And to the credit of the Chinese Communist Party, they've done a lot to make China, life in China, a lot more pleasant, right? So infrastructure is fantastic. Transportation is world class. There are practically no slums in China. Their cities are orderly, tidy, that sort of thing, right? So to that extent, obviously the CCP has delivered on quite a lot of it. But again, when it comes to people's fears about their future, employment. There's a book that just that came out earlier this year, and the book, it was a sensational hit in China. I think I read it sold, as at the last count, it sold more than 2 million copies. And it's about a guy who basically, the book is called like Deliver Parcels in Beijing. And it was about a guy who was really kind of like a writer. His passion is writing, and he's a writer basically. And what he wanted was a job that would just pay him enough so that he can then pursue his writing. So he started taking all these gig jobs, right? So I think he took about 37 different gig jobs. So, delivering parcels, and he basically calculated how many parcels he needed to deliver just to be able to make the amount of money he needed. And beyond that, so he was documenting all of this, and the book has just been a smash hit. I've listened to podcasts and articles written, there've been articles about it, and and the reason why it got so popular is because it resonated with a lot of Chinese people. Because, if you have an economy where 200 million people are basically gig workers, then, that's a huge constituency. You can imagine that the whole population of Nigeria is doing one type of employment where, they can sack you very, very easily and all that. So those things they're there, but obviously, so I guess it's difficult to say to the extent which what the Chinese government is doing, projecting to the rest of the world, how much of that is actually the will of the Chinese people, we'll never know. It is not a democracy where somebody can say, oh, we are a party of, cost of living crisis, and then another party will say we are the party of exports, and then the people will decide. That's not going to happen. So there's a quite an interesting dichotomy there, in the sense that, Chinese people want things that any normal person will want, a comfortable life, a roof over their head, being able to feed their families. And those pressures are real, and they're actually there. The pressures of getting into the right schools, academics, and all of those things. They're actually really intense in there. So, what sustains it? I guess the CCP's complete dominance of Chinese life. The party is the state, and the state is the party, in that sort of sense. So a lot of the whatever it is muted. And also, those of us outside of China, we are sort of at the disadvantage in the sense that, Mandarin is not an easily accessible language, right? It's not easy to read or even understand. So a lot of things are happening out there that they just don't travel. They just don't. We get maybe 10% of it, a snippet of it. And it's kind of good. Well, before COVID, things were a lot better when you had so many foreign correspondents in China who had actually mastered the language and were writing for reputable magazines. Obviously, when COVID hit, a lot of them had to leave. So the coverage of China now is a lot worse than it was. So there's still a few foreign correspondents in there, but it's not like before. Now, if you write something that they don't like, they can actually kick you out of the country. That sort of thing. So, we miss out on really trying to understand, and I fear, that if we ever get to, God forbid, if we ever get to an open conflict between the West, maybe the US and China, it might actually just come down to misunderstanding, because just mutual unintelligibility, that, people who cannot really understand each other. You can even talk about the US. At least the US has a lot of their lifetime China experts, people who have actually lived there, who understand the language. I'm thinking of a country like Nigeria, and I wonder, at the highest levels of the Nigerian government, what Mandarin expertise is there? If you were to start from the president,
you lost me at Mandarin.
So I remember when Nigeria and China signed the swap agreement all those years ago. I think, was it 2016 or something? And the that thing was delayed because Nigeria had no Mandarin expertise, right? And obviously the Chinese made the point of sending the agreement in Mandarin, right? So Nigeria had to run around. From what I understand, I might be wrong here, but I think if my memory serves, what I was after trying to get some kind of Mandarin expertise to, they then had to go back to the Chinese and say, look, give us this thing in English, right? We can't understand, we can't decode it, that sort of thing. And I think maybe eventually, after much back and forth, then the Chinese then agreed and produced an English version. So, Nigerians are dealing with China quite a lot, and you have to ask yourself, what Mandarin expertise, what kind of understanding of what is actually really going on in there, which is why for me I try to just read as many China books as possible, because it's a huge, vast country. There's just so much of it you don't know. You'll probably only be able to know if you're not in Mandarin. Okay, you're probably limited to knowing maybe 5 or 10% or of the country. So we are at a disadvantage. The West is open, right? Everybody can read about the minute details of what Donald Trump is doing. We all have access to the language. We all have access. I mean, it was something I noticed here, during the Brexit debate and Brexit negotiations. And I will see, I'll come on Twitter online and I'll just see Nigerians actually arguing very, very deeply over Brexit, talking about the different aspects of it, because it was just kind of like open to the world, right?
Yep.
It's English. All the debates in Parliament are in English, but I mean, if China is doing, if they're in the Politburo Standing Committee having a meeting, who knows what they're talking about, So I think, to wrap up your point about, how much of it, how is the CCP able to sustain what it is doing? To be honest, I guess the party knows best in this case. I think that's what's happening there. A lot of Chinese people probably don't really agree with a lot of what their country is doing. I mean, when the tariffs, for example, happened, they were obviously they were deleting a lot of social media comments in China, but there were people talking about it that, you don't care about us, right? You're saying that, when maybe the US slapped tariffs on China and then China also slapped tariffs on the US, and a lot of Chinese people are saying, like, look, this is our livelihood, right? We sell to the US, but you don't care about us. You're just only interested in your battle because this doesn't affect you, doesn't affect your children. That's all. Obviously, all those comments get deleted and all that. And there'll always be those things. So in that sense, we'll probably never know. We'll probably never know. This maybe would end at some point. The relations might improve. Maybe Donald Trump leaves office and then things will reset, that sort of thing. Or maybe even Xi Jinping leaves office and then, another person. Because look, we've had Chinese leaders who have not been this belligerent before, or this kind of like, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, all these guys, they just wanted to sell stuff, and they were very, very careful about not, causing, not making enemies, basically. But now you have a different type of, I mean, look at the sparks going on between Japan and China at the moment. The kind of incendiary stuff they're saying, and even though it was the Japanese guys who actually waded into the matter, but really, there's just so much going on. Exactly. I always use one example of, I remember in 2018 I was in Thailand, and at that time the Thai government, the Thais were under one of their uncountable military leadership, So exactly. So there was in Phuket, which is kind of like one of the big tourist resorts. There was a boat, a tour boat that capsized and killed, and pretty much everyone. I think it was about 50 people, if memory serves, right? So the boat capsized and about 50 tourists died, and most of all the tourists were pretty much all Chinese. It was a big scandal because tourism industry is very, very sensitive to this any kind of little thing. And then it became such a headache for the Thai government. And then the Thai military ruler at the time, maybe because he was new in office and he would get frustrated, and he just blurted out one day and said that, look, he said the thing out that nobody wanted him to say, but maybe people were thinking already that the reason why that accident happened was because it was a Chinese tour operator and they were cutting costs, right? So the Chinese tour operator was cutting costs and selling cheap tours to people in China, and kind of like falling under regulation and all of that. So when he said that, the response from China was heavy, right? They basically said, they were going to decapitate the Thai industry, because at the time, like anybody in China's near abroad, a big chunk of the tourism industry was from China, right? So I think they just basically stopped Chinese people from going to Thailand on holiday immediately. And in a matter of months, the employment in the Thai tourist industry had dropped by about 10%. These things all operate on very, very fine margins. So, I mean, and then Thai people get angry that people are losing their jobs. Why did you go and say that kind of thing? And, the Thai military guy actually came out. He was groveling and basically apologized. I'm sorry. It was a mistake. He misspoke. That sort of thing. But, it was just the kind of bullying that, under maybe Hu Jintao or the previous guys, maybe there was somebody that just called him and just said, look, we don't like what you just said. Let's sort this out and all that. But it was all done very, very publicly. The Chinese government came after them, bullied the guy, and, he quickly recanted and all that. And they can do economic damage to you, right? Very, very easily. Because if you are in that neighborhood, one way or the other, you are actually reliant on a lot of Chinese business in that sense. So it might be that these things might change. Actually, we know that Donald Trump is going to be there for 4 years or whatever. But actually, Xi Jinping has now been in office for 13 years now. It's coming up. It'll be 14 years next year. Nothing says he will be in office forever. So, the next person might come and decide that, what, all this saber rattling over Taiwan, all this argument, all this chest beating and all that, maybe this is not for us. Maybe we still have some way to go. We're still a middle income country and we still have some way to go to get rich. Maybe we need to chill out before we start, I don't know.
Maybe
not throwing our
it's
weight around.
interesting. It's interesting how much of this, listening to you boils down to even the personalities that are in power. I think Xi Jinping is the closest thing to Mao that China has had since 1978. And even the Japanese row you were talking about, I think their current leader is probably the most conservative since Junichiro Yoshihito. The guy, I forgot his name, the guy that just couldn't stop going to the World War II shrines and getting China mad every time. And obviously there's Donald Trump in the US. And if the trend continues, you guys might have Farage too in a couple of years.
Yeah.
So, but my final question to wrap up to you would be then, what do you see for the world precisely? From an African Nigerian perspective, in terms of how to approach this new reality, however long it lasts. It might be brief, it might be extended. So, specifically, if you were running policy on trade in Nigeria, how would you deal with the China shock?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so I think obviously, unfortunately Africa is a place, like I always say, Africa is a place, and Nigeria in particular is a place where history happens to. So things happen to us that we don't really fully get. But if I was doing it, right, the way I would try to square this circle would be to say, look, I'm going to go to China and discuss that, look, you have a lot of excess capacity, right? I want your excess capacity moved over to Africa. At least let's even start as a starting point. Okay, fine. Bring the Chinese people to come and do it, right? What I want as a starting point is that thing should be happening in Nigeria.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Fine. Let it be a Chinese-owned company, a steel company or whatever. Let the senior management be Chinese, for whatever. But at least, come and situate it in Nigeria, first of all. All these things that you're doing in China, all this manufacturing, this low value manufacturing stuff, actually come and do it in Nigeria. And then, as a first step, and then use Nigeria as an export base. Right. So you have a lot of, there's a lot of capacity in China that you just cannot use as an actual policy. I want you to, I want to have a kind of agreement where you can bring that excess capacity, bring it into Nigeria, let it come and happen within Nigeria's borders. And at this point, now this would be a good point to wield import tariffs or something and say in exchange for this, right? Rather than say, okay, look, be specific about the industries you want. So want to target an industry. Let's just say something like, say, wig making industries, for example. Say, okay, we want you to bring this stuff, or maybe some chemical. We want you to bring this stuff into Nigeria. And then we can say, otherwise, we slap big tariffs on them, right? bring them into the country. Fine. You don't, I mean, you can actually own it 100%, at least for the first whatever, right? You can own the company but what we want is for it to be happening in Nigeria. And then that's the first step. Then the second bit will then be on our own side. And this is something that Nigeria has to do. Nobody's going to do it for Nigeria. Have a clear strategy for technology transfer. The kind of thing that's happened with cement must never happen again, must not be allowed to happen again, where, 20 years later, you cannot do this thing on your own. You have not mastered any technology and all of that. So, you have to have a strategy on the Nigerian side. And this is not something you have to do with China, but it's something that you have to be deliberate about. China is not going to hand it to you. If they've spent decades learning something, they're not just going to hand it to you on the plate and all that. So you have to be deliberate about wanting to be able to get all of this. And, things like this will include, it seems like we don't do enough sciences in Nigeria, enough STEM courses. So if you're going to actually, build a cadre of engineering talent and all those kind of, that can actually take things, reverse engineer them, all that kind of stuff, right? Bring all of those in there. So those would be my, at the minimum, that would be my approach to it. That first of all, we want to target certain industries where China has a lot of excess capacity, but that capacity is still sitting in China and they are exporting things to Nigeria. That, okay, bring that capacity, bring it over, right? Come and situate it in Nigeria. We'll do what we can for you, right? Free trade zone, we'll give you land, we'll provide some infrastructure. And obviously the thing that will be kind of like difficult and the real meat that you want to get is, first of all, structure it in a way whereby a local supply chain can emerge, because this is one of the ways in which China really dominates a lot of stuff, in the sense that look at, and it's not unheard of. Look at Tesla, right? When Tesla went to China rolled out the red carpet for it because they knew what they wanted out of it, in the sense that as long as Tesla was there, they wanted a whole supply chain ecosystem to emerge around Tesla. And it didn't take that long. Okay, we'll supply you the mirrors, we'll supply you the tires, we'll supply you the chips, all those kind of things. And before you know what's happening, that ecosystem had grown. And in a short period of time, they were able to start manufacturing their own cars by themselves. So, if you target an industry and say, okay, right, so maybe, I don't know, something that produces finished goods, some kind of finished chemical or all that. So, okay, if we bring this to Nigeria, what is the kind of supply chain that can emerge around it? And that supply chain will obviously be Nigerian company. That's where you need to target, right? So get that excess capacity to come with a plan of developing a supply chain around it. And then, when you develop that, then you start to build up kind of expert. And look, this is not a 5-year thing. This is 5, 10, 15 years, 20-year plan. But, when are you going to start? It's yesterday, right? You have to get that, rather than just sitting down there saying, oh, all of a sudden Donald Trump comes into the office, he slaps tariffs on China. Next thing, you just start seeing all kinds of things appearing in Nigeria, and okay, they're cheap, yeah, and that's good enough for us. So we'll just be happy with them. So that'll be my approach. At the minimum, get that, target that excess capacity in China that we are currently buying, and target it to come over. Try to get a supply chain around it and develop your strategy for technology transfer. Because look, we talk about this all the time, right? Manufacturing will always be a small part of the economy, but there is a effect of it. There is no leader anywhere in the world that will not put on a hard hat or a high-vis vest to go and commission a factory. Everybody likes doing it, and it's because of the psychological signal it sends out to a lot of people, to the leadership, to the country, that okay, we are making stuff, right? Services will always be the biggest chunk of the economy. Even China, services.
Yeah, absolutely.
At least,
historically, that has always been true.
Exactly. It's always been the case. Manufacturing has never been the majority of the Chinese economy, even before reform and opening and all of that stuff. So, but, that manufacturing, even if it's 20, 30% of it, it carries so much value. People learning how to make stuff, learning how to being able to make things and selling things, those things. There's just that expertise that develops around it that you just cannot really buy it in the market, right? So there'll always be value in producing things and making stuff. So yeah, so that's the way I would do it. But unfortunately, I don't know what Nigeria trade policy is at the moment. It just seems to be the whole, tariff this, find one local champion, support them, and then hope
I've come
everything
to
goes well.
really, really loathe that phrase "local champion." I think
Yeah.
and I'm gonna rant about it in my new piece. It's been really abused. But I mean, to your point on science, cannot really be overemphasized. One of the things I'll do, and people are gonna be mad about this, if I become president today, like one of the first things I will do if I get like day one, executive orders. I hate executive orders, but for this I won't mind. Is to close all federal universities in Nigeria, like privatize every single one of them, except 6. For diversity reasons. Have each one in each geopolitical zone research institutions purely. That's the only thing that the federal
Yep.
government will fund. Just research institutions, one each in each geopolitical zone. Everything else, privatize. I'm sure the real estate, the land itself has value. Just privatize everything because the we talked about credit and firms, but these things don't just happen. It is learning by doing. But the learning part is extremely important. There's a lot of investment in science and fundamental research in China, and that's been going on for decades.
Oh yeah.
Which
Yeah.
which is not something we really value, but we just assume, like people just assume that, oh, there are talents in Nigeria. And then you see one guy in one village with one junk helicopter. I'm sure you see all those stories, and
Yeah.
you get
Yeah.
you get all the awe effect on social media that, oh, if government was not stupid, like this person, would have started our own helicopter manufacturing, right there in that village in Jos Plateau or whatever, as if that is how things happen. So for me, to answer that question, I would just add that be deliberate. Be
Yes,
deliberate.
exactly.
A lot of our policy is we just like you said, they just happen to us. We are not deliberate about anything. We just go with the flow. Nigeria, we are big, we are awesome. Let's see what happens, right? And I mean that's never really been a good strategy. On a final note, are you bullish or bearish on the global economy side of things? Still talking about the China shock.
I'm starting to get worried. People are, there's a lot of negativity out there. People are talking a lot of, and obviously, I mean, the little investments I have is quite exposed to the U.S. economy. So, I'm kind of like a bit worried in the sense that the way people are talking things up, and maybe there's some kind of global shock around the corner, maybe from AI or whatever. I think the AI one, this is not, a lot of the funding for this stuff is equity. So if there's some kind of crash, I guess those people will get wiped out. It's not like the housing bubble of the other time. So, but I'll probably say overall, I'm kind of cautious at the moment. I'm hoping we can ride through. There's just too much chaos in the system everywhere right now. Everything's are really, really volatile. And we have a lot of volatile actors in place, in the sense that, Donald Trump obviously is one, but even Xi Jinping and China they're quite volatile in their own way, in the sense that they are going to actually, they're not afraid to use the leverage they have, cause some chaos here and there, that sort of thing, and then they just do it, things that just cascade around the world. So, but we'll see. Hopefully maybe we'll ride this all out and then some calm returns. But then, famous last words, I guess. Yeah. All right. Cool. All right, it's good chatting with you. Hopefully, listeners enjoyed that. We'll be back soon with guests. We're gonna take December off. December off for this, and they'll be back in January. So I think this might we're recording we've got a couple of guests to record in the next week and a half. But we might hold on to those episodes until January. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, all right. So if we don't get to speak to you again until January, yeah.
Happy holidays, I guess.
Happy holidays, exactly. All right. See you guys. Cheers.
See you. All right. Thanks.